Just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Admiral Harold Stark issued an order that erased decades of naval precedent. The U.S. Navy was now authorized to sink any vessel flying the Japanese flag. The goal was the absolute starvation of the enemy's war machine. American submarines were ordered to operate independently, hunt down merchant shipping, and completely sever the island nation's supply lines and maritime communications. It was an exceptionally dangerous assignment. The submarine force made up only 1.6% of the entire Navy's personnel, yet these crews would suffer the highest casualty rate in the U.S. military. By the end of the war, 22% of the men who went on combat patrols were killed in action. To execute this massive campaign, the Navy relied heavily on a single weapon, the Mark 14 torpedo. These massive 21-inch steel cylinders were the essential tools meant to choke out Japanese logistics. But as captains began engaging targets across the Pacific, they reported a horrifying reality. They were lining up textbook shots on enemy freighters and warships, only to watch their torpedoes run wildly off course, detonate prematurely in open water, or strike the enemy hulls with a dull thud and fail to explode. When these frontline commanders sent furious reports back to base, the Bureau of Ordnance, the department responsible for designing the weapons, flatly rejected them. Bureau officials insisted the Mark 14 was functioning perfectly and blamed the failures on the poor marksmanship and inexperience of the submarine crews. Out in the Pacific, American submariners realized they were fighting a deadly two-front war. They had to survive the depth charges of the Japanese Navy while simultaneously fighting the stubborn denial of their own weapons bureaucracy. The crews eventually stopped waiting for headquarters to believe them. They began conducting their own forensic investigations to figure out exactly what was hiding inside the mechanics of the Mark 14. The first major flaw they identified was depth control. Before the war, the torpedoes had been calibrated using dummy exercise heads. When swapped out for heavier live warheads, the trim changed. In combat, the weapons ran 10 to 11 feet deeper than the crews were setting them, passing harmlessly underneath their targets. To prove this to the Bureau, desperate submarine crews at Frenchman's Bay in Australia set up an impromptu test facility. They fired their own torpedoes into fishing nets, physically measuring the holes to provide undeniable visual evidence of the depth error. But fixing the depth only revealed a second flaw, the magnetic influence exploder. This mechanism was designed to sense the magnetic field of a ship and detonate directly beneath the keel, where the armor was thinnest. Instead, the sensors were dangerously unreliable, frequently triggering premature explosions halfway to the target or failing to trigger at all. The third flaw was the most bitterly ironic. If the magnetic exploder failed, the weapon had a backup contact exploder. But if a submarine captain executed a perfect 90-degree hit on an enemy hull, the sheer force of the direct impact would bend and jam the firing pin, preventing detonation. Only a glancing blow at an oblique angle would actually trigger the explosion.
The Bureau of Ordnance had engineered a torpedo where the reward for flawless tactical execution by a submarine captain was a guaranteed failure to detonate. Yet, a jammed firing pin was preferable to the Mark 14's final and most terrifying mechanical failure. Occasionally, the internal gyro system would malfunction upon launch, preventing the torpedo's rudder from straightening out. This caused the weapon to enter a circular run. On March 26, 1944, the USS Tullibee fired 2 torpedoes at a Japanese troopship. Instead of striking the target, one of the weapons locked into a circular course, returning to strike the Tullibee in a massive explosion. The submarine sank immediately, leaving only a single survivor in the water. The most famous victim of this flaw was the USS Tang. Commanded by Richard O'Kane, the Tang was the deadliest and most successful American submarine of the entire war, officially credited with sinking 33 ships. In October 1944, the Tang was engaging a large convoy in the Taiwan Strait. After wreaking havoc on the enemy ships, the crew fired their 24th and final torpedo of the patrol. The weapon broached, curved 180 degrees to the left, and 20 seconds later slammed directly into the Tang's aft torpedo room. The sub went down in 180 feet of water. A handful of the trapped crew managed a harrowing escape from the forward torpedo room using breathing devices called Momsen lungs. It remains the only known time in history this device was used to escape a sunken submarine in combat. 78 men were lost. It was a devastating paradox of the early Pacific War. The very weapons designed to secure victory were actively hunting and killing the Navy's most elite sailors. By late 1943, Admiral Charles Lockwood, the commander of the Pacific Submarine Force, forced a change. He bypassed the Bureau of Ordnance's excuses by running his own controlled tests and presenting the raw data to the Chief of Naval Operations. Confronted with proof that the weapons were failing even under perfect conditions, the Bureau was finally forced to authorize mechanical fixes. Once the leashes were off and the weapons actually detonated on impact, American submarines became an unstoppable force of destruction. They systematically dismantled Japan's maritime supply chain, operating with lethal clinical efficiency. This chart shows total Japanese shipping losses. American submarines sank over 1,300 ships, totaling 5 million tons. As you can see, that tiny submarine force, just 1.6% of the Navy, was solely responsible for 55% of all shipping destroyed. Contrast this with the Imperial Japanese Navy. Japan possessed an elite submarine fleet with highly reliable torpedoes, but they rigidly adhered to a pre-war doctrine that restricted submarines to scouting for the main surface fleet. As a result, their impact on Allied logistics was minimal. The campaign succeeded because the Navy eventually prioritized field data over institutional theory. The impact of the submarine force didn't depend on perfect design, but on the willingness of a bureaucracy to listen to the men pulling the trigger.